Good morning. I'm John Bitson, the Menard Family Director of the Sheila and Robert Challey Institute for Global Innovation and Growth. Welcome to the Human Progress and Flourishing Workshop. I'm really excited that today we're joined by Ben Klutsey, and Ben is a great friend and somebody who's really helped us with the Challey Institute a lot, helped us to grow quickly and be successful. He's a great friend, and it's just super fun to see him here. We had a lot of fun yesterday. We ran the Pluralist Lab with some students. I think the students had a great experience. I know I had a great experience with it. And then it was a lot of fun last night with our screening of Undivide Us, the movie that Ben stars in. Anyway, so that was really a lot of fun. And I'm excited that today he's going to talk about his Pluralist Lab and the pluralism program that he has, and just talk about polarization and how we can kind of combat the polarization that's occurring in our country. So Ben Klutsey holds dual roles at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. As the Director of Academic Outreach, he engages with university centers to foster collaborations and knowledge sharing about effective program building. Through his role as Director of the Program on Pluralism and Civil Exchange, he works with thought leaders and practitioners to advance a deeper understanding of pluralism and its role as a core attribute of a liberal society, and to promote its practice across campuses, civil society, and institutions. He received his MA in International Commerce and Policy at George Mason University and his BA in Government and Philosophy from Lawrence University. So would everyone please give a warm welcome to Ben Klutsey.
Thank you, John, for that very, very warm welcome and introduction. It's exciting to be here. It's very cold here in Fargo, North Dakota. But as I said to a friend, the one thing that's really warm here in Fargo, North Dakota is the people. So everyone has been incredibly kind. This is my second time here, and I've enjoyed it every time I've been here, even though it's been very cold. I'm excited to be here to talk to you about this topic that's near and dear to my heart. I'll tell you a story. When I was a little boy, at about 11 years old, I had the chance to travel outside of where I lived. I grew up in Ghana, West Africa. And for the very first time, I got the chance to get on a plane and go to a different continent. I'd never left the continent of Africa. We were excited when my parents announced that we were going outside of the country and of the continent. When the day came, we were just beside ourselves with joy. First time hopping on the plane, first time experiencing turbulence. I remember telling my dad that it felt like there were potholes in the air, and he had a pretty good laugh about that. But we landed in a small town, the Dutch-German border, called Emden. It was a town of about 50 to 60,000 people. And we landed, myself, my three siblings. The building in which we lived, we looked across the street and we saw a playground that was appealing to us as kids. And we saw other kids, were screaming and yelling and just having extreme fun. And as kids, we said, oh no, we definitely ought to join them now. So we put on our shoes really quickly. We ran outside of the door. And just about 6 feet before we got to the edge of the playground, all the kids stopped playing. They stopped. And then they started crying and screaming. At that point, they looked at us and they pointed at us. And they said the N-word over and over and over again. It was a strange experience to myself and my siblings. We were sad, and then we had this sense that we didn't belong here. The sense that we didn't belong. And that we carried that for a very long time throughout our entire trip in Europe. Fast forward 7 years later, I get the chance to travel again outside of the continent of Africa to a different continent that I'd never been. This time I land in Allegheny County Airport in Appleton, Wisconsin. Get picked up, land on campus. The childhood in a sense was gone. I was a little scared and worried what I might experience, given what I'd seen 7 years prior. But what I experienced there surprised me, and it shouldn't have. But I was embraced with open arms. I was completely welcomed, and I was treated with respect, with authenticity, and I was welcomed to be curious. It didn't matter the funny clothes I wore or the accent that I had, but it was one of the most welcoming places I'd ever been. And I experienced what I call the Appleton love. I think it's very similar to the Fargo love that I experience when I'm here. But people treated me with real dignity and respect. The first story was sort of a story where I felt like I didn't belong, and I think most of us have heard these types of things where people are otherized and marginalized or considered to be a them, and I felt it. But this time in Appleton, I just felt the opposite, and it was just a joy to be there. I got really emotional after 4 years when I had to leave. I graduated. I think there's a fine line between feeling marginalized and then feeling like we truly belong. So the question that has animated my work over the past few years is, how can we live together and coexist amidst deep divides and differences? Because there are divides and differences. Now, certain trends are creating, barriers for coexistence. And this is a question that's more important now because for the first time in history, I think we're seeing large, growing, multi-ideological, heterogeneous societies. And so we have to kind of think about these things. The first thing that comes to mind is populism. And populism is a term that's a little bit difficult to pin down. Some, think of it as a kind of attitude, a certain feeling, a sense of discontent. But there are a number of scholars who will identify certain, key features about populism. And I'd like to highlight 3 of them here. The first is an anti-establishment feeling. And populists would express, faith in ordinary people over elites, like, politicians and bankers and academics and journalists, scientific experts, and so on. And they have a deep cynicism of elites and experts. And, you can't always fault them for some of the cynicism. It seems to emerge in an environment where there's a lack of trust of institutions. Martin Gurry, who used to be a CIA analyst and now a colleague, a fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, wrote a book called The Revolt of the Public. And in Revolt of the Public, he highlights, ways in which people have lost trust with institutions. You can go back a few decades. You can pick your example, whether it was the weapons of mass destruction that were never discovered in Iraq, whether it was the financial crisis that we were told that we were going to be fine, that everything was okay, and then there was a huge collapse, financial collapse, or even during COVID, where the experts were saying things, but information kept changing as things were moving very, very rapidly. And so people lose trust over time. And that fosters this anti-establishment movement. And we've seen trends of the years from the Occupy movements, the Tea Party, and so on, that this thing has been around. So there's anti-establishment. The other thing is sort of an authoritarian fever, as I'd like to call it, that favoring personal power exerted by strong, charismatic leaders. There's a certain attraction to strong man politics or strong woman politics, and that these leaders reflect the views of majority of ordinary people as expressed, whether through polls or referenda and so on, rather than sort of the checks and balances that the constitutional system provides. And we've seen examples, not just in the US, we've seen examples in France, Marine Le Pen, in Hungary, Viktor Orban. But it's there, this attraction towards strongman politics. And then finally, there's a sense of sort of nativism as well, that assumes that the people are a uniform whole, and people favor sort of monoculturalism over multiculturalism, favoring exclusionary immigration policies and so on. The sense that the culture ought to be intact, unchanging, but we know that culture isn't necessarily static. It evolves and it changes over time as you have sort of a mix of people in a population. And we've seen this, again, these things aren't just American problems, but we see some examples too, like in Germany, for instance, when there was a backlash with the Syrian refugees in the aftermath of the war in Syria moving into Germany. So anti-establishment, authoritarianism, sense of nativism. Niels Carlson, who's a Swedish economist, says that the kind of populism you see, you identify, he can see some three features. It's unserious policies or oversimplified policies that emerge that populists like to throw out. There's an us versus them thinking that's similar to the anti-establishment idea that I mentioned. And then this sort of autocratic approach to governance. So why do we see a rise in populism? There are different views and different opinions. I mentioned lack of trust as one. I think it's an important one. It's a big one. But also economic situations changing is another important one. That due to technological changes and due to international trade, some jobs will be lost and some people will feel vulnerable, and that tends to draw people towards populism. And then, some have talked about a cultural backlash, that there's a backlash against progressive cultural tides. I think there's some truth to that. But there are many reasons why populism is on the rise. It's important to note that it isn't just a right-wing thing or a left-wing thing, but there are different flavors. The left-wing populism favors more redistribution, economic policies, welfare-oriented programs. Right-wing variant favors deregulation, low taxes, and so on. But both tend to offer policy, solutions that seem a bit too simplistic. So I think populism does contribute to the kinds of divisions that we are experiencing right now in the United States. And then there is polarization. Many of you have studied this, have thought about this, but the sense that there's a lot of division in the country. But when people talk about polarization, they mean different things. There is political polarization. Rachel Kleinfeld, who's a fellow at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, said that about 50 years ago, political scientists thought that there wasn't enough polarization, that the political parties, it wasn't always clear what they stood for, because you had liberal Democrats, conservative Democrats, you had liberal Republicans, conservative Republicans. So perhaps there ought to be a little bit more polarization so you can really determine what the differences are or what the differences were. But basically, political polarization is the ideological distance between parties. And there are. We've always had ideological distances in this country where people have ideas that don't necessarily overlap. And then there is affective polarization. And that's sort of beyond the differences of opinions. It's no longer that I disagree with you, I don't like the politician that you support, but your views are a threat to my existence. And so I have to hold a very extreme view because you are likely to hold extreme views as well. And that is a feeling that emerges. Affective polarization, Monica Guzman would say it's the sorting, it's the othering, it's the siloing that leads to this. The sorting in that we are increasingly living in geographic spaces and even virtual spaces where we are with like-minded people who agree with us on everything. They share the same values, ideas, and we're not experiencing or encountering as much difference. And the more you spend time with people who agree with you on everything, the more your views become intense. And some would say you swap your very benign views to more extreme ones, depending on where you are. And when you are with people who are like-minded, you tend to see people who don't agree with you as the other. And they tend to be seen in the worst possible light. And then the siloing, you just remain entrenched, you remain in your echo chambers, you remain in your corners, not wanting to, mingle with those on the other side. So that's affective polarization. And then there are others. Rachel Kleinfeld talks about pernicious polarization. That's to what extent does the system itself incentivize polarization? Now we see that most congressional seats are in predominantly red or blue districts. And the folks who get involved in the primary processes are the most intense in their views. So if you win the primary, you're likely to win the election. You get the most polarized politicians who use the most intensive and divisive rhetoric to motivate their base. And at the end of the day, you have, just two options at the ballot box. So you have a whole sort of electoral system that sort of incentivizes people towards polarization. So we've got populism that's on the rise. We've got, polarization, different affective polarization in particular, that is on the rise. But in the midst of all of this, we have to figure out how to live together and coexist amidst deep divides and differences. As I alluded to earlier, Yasha Monk in his book, The Great Experiment, talked about how some of the most celebrated democracies throughout history have been homogeneous societies. And so for the first time, in world history, we're seeing large, growing, multi-ethnic, multi-ideological democracies. And so we're in sort of a transitional moment where we have to figure out how to do this and how to do this really, really well. My colleague Kevin Vallier, in his book Trust in a Polarized Age, talks about how across Western democracies, the United States has seen the steepest decline in social trust. And so if we can't trust each other, it's going to be very hard for us to work together, especially when we're polarized. I think that's why we have to understand pluralism. John Inazu at the University of Washington, St. Louis says, we have to seek a modest unity, and that the idea of a pluribus unum might be a little bit elusive. It's a bit abstract, and we can be united in everything. But we have to seek a modest unity, that there's some basic things that maybe perhaps we can agree on, maybe national defense, sewer systems, that type of thing. What is pluralism? It's two things. One, the fact of difference, the fact that we live in a diverse, multi-ethnic society. And people have different preferences, different interests. We differ in everything from the flavor of ice cream that we prefer, or the kind of pizza you prefer. Some people like anchovies pizza, some people like pepperoni pizza. Or the purpose of the nation, religious affiliations, and so on. So many differences. And then there is how we ought to engage with this difference that we're experiencing. Our response to it, how we interact with others, because pluralism isn't just the fact that we're different, but it's that we ought to engage as well. And to do that, we have to take our constitutional commitment seriously. That we have to be attached in a lot of the values that are embedded within the Bill of Rights. That those things give us the right processes for operationalizing how we can live together across differences. And then there is something he calls the civic aspirations. But he also says that pluralism has two very important features. The first one is the idea of inclusion. That over time, as a society becomes more and more morally enlightened, we begin to include more and more people who may have originally been marginalized from our society. And we've seen that America has been an amazingly dynamic country that has over time been able to include more and more people, whether we're talking about women's suffrage, we're talking about civil rights, or what have you. America has reconstructed itself over the past several decades and a couple of centuries. But there's another important feature about pluralism, which is the idea of dissent. That a truly pluralistic society has to allow for dissent and disagreement. That people have to be able to disagree with orthodoxies, current trends. They have to be able to introduce heterodox ideas. They have to be able to form their own associations based on their beliefs and values. The Bill of Rights, the Constitution allows us to do that. We ought to. So you have inclusion and you have dissent. You can clearly see that these two things can be in tension a lot of the times. And that a truly pluralistic society is one that is able to live with and sustain this tension over a long period of time. To do that well, we need not only the constitutional commitments, but we need the civic aspirations. Number one is toleration. Toleration comes from the Latin word tolero, which means to endure. trying to accept genuine differences, including profound moral disagreement. Not approval, not that you have to approve of someone else's view of the world, but you can tolerate them. And then humility, which requires some self-reflection, recognizing that we are limited in trying to prove some things, that at some point I may not be able to prove to you that my view of the world is the best one. I have to be humble about that you're not going to be able to convince everyone of your views. It's important to recognize that. And then the third one is patience. That it takes a long time for change to come about, whether it's your policy preference, whatever it is. It's going to take a while to build a coalition, make your case. And then if it doesn't work out, if somebody else wins, you're patient enough to accept and live to fight another day. Civic aspirations of toleration, humility, and patience. And the work that we do at Mercatus on the Pluralism and Civil Exchange program fits within this category. When we are engaged in the Pluralist Lab events, those are the kinds of principles that we talk about. I mentioned respect, authenticity, and curiosity. They're critical. Respect that we have equal dignity with each other. You have as much right to be here as I do. We have to respect each other, number one. Number two is authenticity. And we've seen in surveys across US campuses that students are masking, they're self-censoring. I'm sure NDSU students don't do that. They're very forthright with their opinions. But we say that don't mask your views, be authentic. And finally, we say be curious. It's impossible to be in an educational setting without the ability to be curious, to ask questions, to have open inquiry, to contest ideas. So these three things are critical. Those are the lessons that we learned when we put the movie together, Undivide Us, that some of you saw last night. That we went to cities and towns across the United States, Pittsburgh, Phoenix, Atlanta, talked to average Americans. Respect, authenticity, curiosity, and people treating each other with equal dignity. And it's possible. It's possible because I believe that most Americans have these values and they express them every day. But there is an impression. There's an impression that we're so divided, we're so extremely divided, we cannot have conversations, that we cannot be candid with one another. And it comes from us overestimating how extreme those on the other side are. You get the chance to have regular conversations with people, you realize that they're actually very similar to us. So we are the solution, all of us. We're really the solution. I'll mention a couple of things to wrap up. In Adam Grant's latest book, Think Again, he highlights some really important ideas. He says, oftentimes when we're confronted with ideas and beliefs that are near and dear to our hearts, we are either preachers, prosecutors, or politicians. A preacher, as he or she must be, is unyielding in their faith. They have to proselytize. They have to get people to see the world the way that they do. And so they're unbending. The prosecutor has to exploit the weaknesses in the other side's arguments to make theirs look really, really good. And the politician obviously will say anything to get people on their side. And we can see all of these three things in ourselves. We've been these things at some point. I mean, I think The Gladiator is the best movie of all time. I'm unyielding about that. I'm sure some of you will disagree. But he says we have to take the approach of scientists, where we ask questions. We're like conversational scientists. And we can ask questions and we can be curious about one another. When the 2016 election happened, Monica Guzman, who lives in Seattle, her county went 76% Hillary Clinton. And she woke up in the morning and you realize the entire country had gone the other direction. And she and her friends just could not understand how that was possible. And so she took a busload of people from Seattle to go to another part of the country that was the direct opposite. They went to a county in Oregon where 76% of them voted for Donald Trump. They had an entire day with them, entire day of conversations to learn about who are these people. The experience was enlightening, as she writes about it in her book. I never thought of it that way. And she realized there was something, a law, a regulation about the water body close to that county, that it seemed as though it would be difficult for them to retain if they had different policies, different politicians. But they voted based on that they would be able to protect their land. That was the most animating thing for them in that election. That surprised them because they had all kinds of assumptions about why they voted the way they did. And an older gentleman in all those interactions at the end of it said to her, "For the very first time, I feel seen. For the very first time, I feel seen." Because sometimes when you're in a rural area, you have to do business in the urban areas. You have to go and sell your eggs or sell whatever it is that you do. You have to do business there. But those in the urban areas never have to go to the rural areas. For the first time, he felt seen. That's important. Making sure that we each feel seen. To be curious about one another. The second thing I'd say is to be aware of conflict entrepreneurs. There are people who are exploiting all the differences that we have. They want to capitalize on it for political gain, for profit. We have to be aware of that. It's important. And sometimes we have to avoid binary thinking. It's either X or it's Y. No. A lot of the issues and a lot of the challenges that we face have a lot of nuances. And we have to ask ourselves, what am I missing here? All of the time. And finally, when you are in a difficult conversation, you want to get to the place in the conversation where you say, "Oh, I never thought of it that way." It doesn't mean that you agree with everything that the other person says, but that you can see the ways in which that they connect the dots. Now, what I've offered aren't a silver bullet. It doesn't mean that once you do this, we're going to solve the problem of affective polarization. But each of us can play our part. There are those who are running organizations and doing things and trying to bridge divides and so on. But in your own little corner, you can have good conversations wherever you are and make sure that the person that you're talking to feels seen. It's the little things. While others work on how they might change the political environment, the electoral system, and so on, there are lots and lots of solutions there too. But I think we can all do our part. Why is pluralism important? It's because we have lots and lots of problems to solve in this country. And if we cannot sit together, we cannot work on building consensus, all those problems are going to be there, festering, probably getting worse. So thank you. Thank you for taking the time to join me to listen to this about polarization, pluralism, and populism. Appreciate it. If you have questions, yes.
Thank you very much. Very, very informative. I really appreciate you coming here and share with us your views. And I had a two-part question. Number one, I was wondering if you can speak to the phenomena that I've noticed. So I grew up overseas as well, and I moved here as an adult. And I noticed that the most opinionated individuals who are engaged in this kind of behavior are not the ones who perhaps are going to be solving the issue. So what I mean by that is that they're placing all that energy into issues that they're not going to really solve. And the people who are going to solve these issues are the ones that are least opinionated, the ones that you don't hear about. And part B, I was wondering if you can talk about that in the context of universities. Because when I see so many videos online of smart, passionate 21-year-old students who engage in behavior that I would consider detrimental to their overall ambitions, but also to their objective of changing the other person's view. What I mean by that is the way that they deliver their message, how they go about delivering it, in terms of the shutting people off or just using specific types of words. And I say this because it's very dangerous for society when the future leaders, as I like to call them, engage in this type of behavior, and they're building the habit. Because as they get older, when they become, let's say, my age, it's going to be too late for them to realize or to change their approach. When it's like, yes, your message is valid, but it's just the way that you go about as to express your message. I'm just wondering if you can talk about that.
Great questions. In Yuval Levin's book, A Time to Build, he talks about how universities were presumed to be places where you learn how to be a good professional. So there's whether you're learning to be an architect or something like that, you do that, you learn that there. You're given a sense of morality as well, understanding the problems in the world. Number two, and then number three, a liberal education where you learn to ask questions and challenge. It seems as though the moralizing has taken precedence over the other things, as he observes, and that we have to get to a place where we're a bit more balanced. When I think of young people, I cut them a little bit of slack because I see young people who are very energized, very excited, and they're seeking meaning and purpose and are looking for their role in the world. And a lot of them are exercised around the issue of justice. I mentioned some of this last night, around the issue of justice, right? And when they see wrong in the world, they really want to fight it and push back and challenge. And I think that some of them look at the world with a bit of a narrow lens, right? And they define the world that way. The challenge is that a society doesn't thrive only on justice. Justice has to be balanced with other virtues like wisdom and prudence and mercy and all these things that are really, really important. And I think that a good, educated, a person who expresses strong civic virtues has to ask themselves a lot of questions, and they have to try to look at the world in multiple lenses. That there are different reasons why things happen. You have to understand, have to ask more questions, be curious. That kind of thing sometimes we hope that with age, people will be able to, learn these values. But, that would be my advice to the young people, that you might see the world one way. You have to try to accommodate different lenses, the way that you look at the world. My background, living in the United States, and I remember growing up, one of the most memorable experiences that I ever had was, my father saying to me, when you walk outside of these four walls, I don't want you to challenge authority, challenge the government and all that, otherwise we'll get in trouble. And we had a Marxist revolution, and I talked about this the last time I was here, Marxist revolution that nearly put my dad in jail. So we were worried until I came to the United States, where I have professors who said, no, we want you to challenge, push back. And I always tell young people that the values that we have here in the United States on freedom of speech, religion, expression, all these things are critical. And that is the kind of thing that you can take for granted until it's gone. And if you want to really be a part of something meaningful, work hard towards building and sustaining those types of values. That would be what I'd say to young people. Molly McGrath says that we are in a world where we have sort of purifiers and we have menders. To your first question, that purifiers want to, burn things down, drain the swamp, whatever it is that they want to do, right? Just extreme frustration about what's going on. And then there are the menders who want to, solve problems and build new institutions. And I think that we have to be aware of how hard it is to build, right? Edmund Burke said that rage and frenzy can pull more down in half an hour than prudence, deliberation, and foresight can build in 100 years. It takes a lot of patience to build something that is sustainable and durable over a long period of time. And, we all have a part to play in that. It requires vision, it requires patience, temperance, and all these things. And that I think what we do with the Pluralist Lab is to try to encourage those who are menders but are quiet to speak up a bit more, build more confidence to engage, because we have the loudest voices, the purifiers, but they're not the majority, right? They're not the majority. And so we have to encourage the menders to get out there and build sustainable institutions and norms and so on. It may not be the best answer, but hopefully it addresses some of the questions that we have. Mm-hmm. Silence. Shy? No. Okay.
So I don't look
Elizabeth, right?
Yes. So you are right that people overestimate the extremity of the other side. You're also right that affective polarization has outstripped. So affective polarization is like you just really don't like something. You're disgusted by them. You're angry with them. It's emotional distance rather than, and that's much wider than the ideological distance. It's also true when you put people in a room and tell them to be nice, they can do so. But that doesn't mean that there aren't extreme people.
Mm-hmm.
So what do we do what is the appropriate response to someone who is in fact quite extreme, who is in fact quite offensive, who is in fact not tolerant? What do we do with it?
It's a difficult question. I think that there are different programs for different circumstances and, different types of people. What we do is that, or what I like to think that we do is that we cannot address the extremes. I think when people are at a certain point, there's almost nothing you can say to kind of convince them or change their mind. Sometimes they're in a very different place in their lives. Whatever is going on, we have all kinds of issues that are happening that I didn't talk about, like mass loneliness and so on, that draw people towards some of these extreme views. And what we want to do is that because we think that the extremes are a minority and that the other folks are in the majority, but they're oftentimes silent, they're oftentimes quiet. We want to raise their voices so that they can, drown out, or at the very least be aware of what's going on. So if you, look at Twitter, for instance, I think I mentioned this yesterday as well, that only 6% of folks on Twitter generate 73% of political tweets, right? And so we're all kind of looking in this arena and seeing this quote unquote noise, but is that truly the reality? And that being aware gives you a better idea of what's going on, at the very least, gives you a little bit of encouragement and a little bit of optimism about what it is that maybe you can do in your own corner, or the extent to which not everyone is like that. I think that awareness is important. But the extremes, it's a difficult point. I don't know how to talk to someone who's an extremist, that there are different people for different. So Daryl Davis, for instance, who has done a lot of great work, he's talked to hundreds of KKK members who have then kind of derobed, if that's the right term. And he has collected these robes of all these people who are now no longer extremists. But that takes a different kind of maybe deprogramming by a certain kind of expert who's engaged that way. This is, I think, a bit of a different approach as well.
Okay, I'll ask a question.
Yeah.
So what you're doing with the Pluralist Lab is super cool. I think it's a great, this whole effort is outstanding. And I know it's kind of a long range thing. I mean, you think about like to change this, in America, it's going to take some time. Do you have any ways you're trying to measure like short-term success, like to try to figure out, is this being effective or not? I just wondered if you thought about that.
Yeah, I mean, for the students who engage in these programs, we have pre-event surveys, post-event surveys, and the goal is to kind of track and continue to ask them questions 6 months down the road, a year, 2 years down the road, how they feel about engaging with others, how they're engaging. So this perspective taking, the approach of like, kind of steel manning other people's viewpoints and so on and so forth. So we can sort of collect that kind of data. We also look at all the surveys that are out there, the ones that you've done as well, ones that we look at, to what extent are students, self-censoring and that kind of thing. So the more we see those numbers improve, the more encouraged we'll be. We cannot always tell whether we are the ones who've contributed to this, but we want to really encourage others. And there are all kinds of different programs out there, which gives me some encouragement from, Braver Angels, living room conversations, and outside of sort of the campus setting. There's so much going on that it gives me a little bit of hope that people will be able to learn how to engage in a more pluralistic society.
And is your film undivided? Have you gotten a really positive response in terms of different places wanting to show more in the future? Yeah, we've film festivals all across the United States, and I think might be in Canada too. And it's interesting. The director, Christy Kendall, she showed it to different audiences that lean left and audiences that lean right. And the first time she showed it to an audience that leaned a bit more to the right, they said it's a really good film, but I don't think that if you showed it to folks on the left, they're going to be really happy with this. And so she showed it to folks on the left, and they also said that it's a pretty neat film, but I don't think the folks on the right are going to really like this. So maybe it shows that we're actually doing something right. And I think that's generated some of the interest and excitement about this work. So, yeah. I think Dave had a question.
My career was with sales and marketing. And in sales, one of the basic lessons is try to understand where your potential customers are coming from. What's important to them? Try to relate to them. Which sounds a lot like what you're talking about the movie, because we spoke about the movie yesterday. But you also realize that sometimes someone's just not interested in whatever you have to sell. And at that point, you thank them for their time and you move on.
Yeah.
And you don't worry about them anymore. What I don't understand, or maybe what I'm fascinated about, is why so many people are so concerned about the 20% at the extremes, rather than the 80% in the middle. They seem like they spend an inordinate amount of time giving attention to that 20%, almost like it's the child who has learned that if I raise a ruckus, I'll get attention from my parents. I don't understand.
Good question. I think the media plays a role in this. You know, sort of showing the spotlight on the most sensational news and the most egregious situations. But I think the legitimate concern here about the folks that's part of the 20% is that it's a small group of people can do a lot of harm, right? And I think that's why people get really worried about that small percentage. You're right? If you slice it, maybe a 9 or so percent on the left and on the right, and it's a tough one, but I think they have potential to do a lot of harm, or at the very least create a certain kind of impression that affects all of us. And I think that's where the concern is. But I agree with you that we have to focus on the sort of folks, the so-called exhausted majority, right? And sometimes they're silent, a silent exhausted majority, as someone would say, and help them to sort of build more confidence to speak up a lot more, and they can help drown out the voices of the extremes.
Sounds like some people need a timeout.
Jeremy.
Hi Ben, good to see you.
Good to see you too.
So I was curious if you could comment on how you view maybe the role of basic manners and politeness, and maybe how that's changed over time. So kind of grew up in a time where, especially if you didn't know somebody, there were certain topics of conversation that were usually considered off limits. First date rules, don't talk about religion, don't talk about politics. Have we changed our manners and how we engage conversation with others? Partly, I think, the fact that we now know whether somebody's a part of our in-group or not, perhaps more easily. Because growing up, you never really know what group the other person is a part of. But now, especially if you have access to their social media account, I can immediately see what their in-group is. And just, so maybe I'm loading the question too much.
Yeah, good word. You don't even have to know their social media account. I think political parties have been so skillful at doing this, so that people now live their politics and their lifestyles. You can determine a certain level of probability how someone votes by the car they drive, where they get coffee, where they get groceries, and not 100%, but they can predict a certain level. There's a wonderful scholar, Andrew Jason Cohen. He's a philosopher. He says that part of the problem is that we tell people that you shouldn't talk about politics, you shouldn't talk about religion, right? And he says, look, maybe we should talk more about those. Like, learn to actually have the conversations well, right? So that it doesn't become a hostile, discussion when you actually get the chance to do it. So, doing it well rather than not doing it at all is much better, he would say. And the manners thing, I agree with you. I think I was just sharing yesterday that, before, cell phones and text and these types of things, if, you wanted to call your friend, you ask your parents to use the phone, and then you call and you say, Mr. Smith, may I please speak to Carl? What do you want? I said, well, I just want to talk about this homework, and okay. And, you learn all these things. Or you go to someone's house, the car, you knock on the door, you greet, you say, someone was saying that, the kids these days, they'll text, and then you'll get there, you come out of the house, hop in the car, there's less of these types of opportunities to learn and build the kinds of manners that you're talking about. But I think, awareness is important. And I think institutions that are places for formation, the family is an important institution. Schools are important institutions. And there are other kinds of organizations in civil society that are good institutions that can help and teach and train students on these types of things, because they're important. They help us, recognize one another's dignity and respect. So, yeah.
Do you think, off of Jeremy's question, do you think that's more so in college campuses, or is it just within the general environment in terms of manners and listening to others? Because you hear about on college campuses where comedians won't even do shows at college campuses. When I was an undergrad, we had lots of comedians, and now comedians only do because they don't want to be subjected to cancellation or things like that. So,
yeah, I'm hesitant to generalize. I think that there are certain things that just don't happen in certain college campuses. We hear these stories a lot on elite campuses, right? So these elite academic institutions, you hear these things a lot. But a lot of campuses, things are fairly, they will have their challenges here and there, but it's fairly normal. So I think that it's something that maybe requires a lot more data collection to kind of understand. I'm hesitant to generalize, but I do see that there are differences in certain kinds of colleges and not others. So.
Okay, unless there's any last question. Okay, well, let's give one more round of applause.
Thank you.